Welcome everyone to the May 2021 Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership webinar. My name is Joel Larson and I'm the Associate Director of the Water Resources Center here at the University of Minnesota, and we are the hosts of MCAP. Today we are joined by John Loomis, but before I introduce him and turn things over, wanted to share a few logistical announcements. For today's webinar, John will talk for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll have the rest of the time as a Q&A. The participants are muted, but you can ask your questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. And you can also upvote those other questions if you would like to see those asked. So please feel free to add those in either just in the Q&A or throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end. We are recording this webinar and we are planning to post it online. And finally, at the end of the webinar, you'll be directed to a brief evaluation. Your feedback is really helpful for us as we both look at how the webinars are going and then also plan for future events. So please take a couple minutes to fill that out if you can at the end. So now we can get to the good stuff, the reason that you all are here. It's my pleasure to introduce John Loomis, who will be talking about building resilience in Southern Washington County. John is an aquatic ecologist by training, holding a BS degree in environmental studies from the University of Kansas and an MS degree in water resources science from the University of Minnesota. For the past decade, John has worked in the South Washington Watershed District, where he develops and oversees district programs to protect and restore water resources within the district. The South Washington Watershed District received the 2021 Minnesota Climate Adaptation Award in the organization category, and so we're excited to hear about the work that they've been doing. So with that, I will turn things over to John. And thank you again for joining us.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for having me. So today I just want to kind of talk through how we ended up where we are currently at South Washington Watershed District, and then end with some examples of the work we're doing. Some of it's work that was well underway before we ever thought about climate adaptation and building resilience. Other work is stuff we've undertaken since our climate planning, but it all relates to building resilience in South Washington County. And hopefully in this discussion, I'll make the point of how it relates. South Washington Watershed District was established in 1993. We cover 71,000 acres, covering 2 different major watersheds. So roughly this part of our district covers or drains the Mississippi River. This part of our district drains to the St. Croix River, Hastings, Cottage Grove, Woodbury, I-94, running from Wisconsin into downtown St. Paul. We cover 12 lakes, 5 of which are currently impaired for excess nutrients, about 120 miles of streams, some still natural, others buried in pipes. We are an MS4, a regulated MS4, and most of our communities are regulated MS4s as well. As a watershed district, we operate based on an adopted watershed management plan, and our current plan was adopted in 2016. By state rule, watershed district plans have to address water quantity and quality, public drainage if you have any drainage ditches, groundwater, wetlands, and they must include capital improvement programs, operation and maintenance programs, information education, data collection programs, monitoring, a regulatory program, incentive programs, and a program for restoring and protecting water resources within the district. And our plan includes all those. And while we were developing that 2016 plan, climate change was obviously on people's minds, and it came up in our planning efforts. A number of our community partners, city partners, brought up climate change during our planning process, but it never rose within that planning process as a high priority. Looking back, I think that's because nobody was sure how climate change fit into a watershed district's work, where it fit into a watershed district management plan. But our plan does, in regard to climate change and adaptation, state as a goal for the district that we want to increase resilience of district resources and public infrastructure through the development of information and strategies and implementation of accepted climate adaptation practices. So that's obviously a very big and broad goal to put in a plan. That was kind of it. As I mentioned, it never rose as a high priority. It's something we had in our plan and anticipated revisiting it and acting on it kind of in the back end of our plan lifetime, which is years 6 through 10. But with that, we obviously knew, and our partners, since they brought it up, knew that we were already seeing the effects of climate change in South Washington County, seeing larger rain events, more frequent rain events, changing patterns of rainfall. So it just seemed like when it was wet, the rain never stopped, and we're seeing more runoff than ever before reach our resources. Winters are changing, as everybody has seen lately and has heard over and over from Kenny Blumenfeld and other folks. And we know that those changes are only going to pick up speed going forward. And it wasn't, 2-3 weeks after adopting our 2016 watershed management plan that our city partners started asking us what we're going to do about climate change, because they were just starting to think about their own comprehensive planning efforts and didn't know what they would be doing. So one of the first actions we took under our brand new 2016 watershed management plan was to actually change the priority of the climate change and resilience line item in that plan. So we changed that priority, got started on developing a climate adaptation resilience plan, right? So we brought in Bar Engineering, Freshwater Society to help us with the subsequent planning effort just focused on climate change and adaptation in Southern Washington County. That planning effort started with 2 day-long workshops. We had about 60 attendees. This was by far the most engaged process we've ever gone through in Southern Washington County. We went from leading up to that 2016 plan where it was obviously on people's minds, but never stood out. We didn't get a ton of engagement from folks, to where these 2 workshops in 2017 just had this 60 people showing up for 2 day-long workshops is just unheard of for us. And it was great. We had citizens, city staff, county staff, kind of focused on different communities. So you see this picture down here, there's folks at different tables. We had a different table for each of our communities. We had a table for Washington County. We had folks from neighboring agencies, Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District staff participated. Some folks from the Washington Conservation District and other watershed districts and WMOs in the county. And these workshops were a mix of education. So we had a state climatologist was there presenting on changes we're seeing already. We had some state agency folks there discussing how those changes were impacting their work and what they were seeing. with different respects. I mean, this rain, we didn't limit it to just watershed district kinds of ideas, lakes and streams and wetlands. It was really open to everything. So it really touched on everything from water quality on up to, society impacts resulting from these changes to the climate that we're seeing. So again, kind of that mix of education and planning exercises. So we gave the group, the tables, lots of opportunities to, amongst themselves, identify their biggest concerns, what they saw as the biggest potential impacts of our changing climate, prioritize those impacts, and start to put together strategies to address them, strategies to protect their communities from the changes that we'll keep seeing going forward. Those risks kind of shook out into 3 sectors, which I don't think are a surprise to anybody. So infrastructure, societal impacts, and natural resources. Infrastructure concerns, I think, rightly centered on flooding risks. So we do have some history of flash flooding concerns in our district, going back to a fairly large rain event in 2005 when a number of homes were impacted by lakes backing up. So that's still on folks' minds. How those change with increased precipitation, power, emergency response plans, storm shelters. So again, we didn't try to limit discussion to anything. So this is just everything that people were worried about in the face of climate change. Same thing along societal priorities, protecting groundwater. We have some fairly large groundwater concerns in South Washington County with the PFAS pollution concerns still playing themselves out. So people are concerned about conservation and protection of groundwater resources, protecting at-risk populations, primarily kind of along our 2 river corridors, all the way to putting together pet emergency response plans. So that kind of grew out of the idea that we can have all these response plans and safe places for people to seek shelter, but they're not going to show up if they can't bring their pets with them. So that got put in there. Obviously not something that a watershed district addresses, but it's in the plan and was identified for those communities to carry forward. And the 3rd sector was natural resources, which I think if you start looking at this list in particular, starts to look an awful lot like what watershed districts are supposed to have in their watershed management plan. So promoting stormwater treatment, stabilizing ravines, building resilient landscapes, building urban forests to intercept and treat rainfall and stormwater runoff, improving parks and open spaces, connecting them. So again, managing that watershed area, managing invasive species, and reducing chloride loading. So again, touching on kind of the de-icing concerns, the potential for polluting groundwater, but also then surface water resources. So at the end of the workshops, we compiled these summaries for each of our communities, supplied these summaries to each of those communities to again inform their future planning on climate adaptation and resiliency at a time when they were just starting to undertake their own comp plan updates. So this summary is for Washington County. So these are all issues identified by Washington County staff that participated in the workshops. You can see it's a pretty good list of things if you can make them out, including coordinating emergency response plans, reducing flooding risk, backup power, storm shelters at county parks, vulnerability assessments, working with community partners to identify and communicate emergency plans with at-risk populations, Create a culture of preparedness using a health equity lens, groundwater protection. But I mean, those, so the point is, you know, we had these workshops full of county residents identifying, you know, their biggest concerns, their fears, and immediately turning it into actions for communities to incorporate into plans and be thinking about as they move forward with their work. So I think it was a very valuable outcome for everybody involved. Separately or subsequently, you know, for South Washington Watershed District, we do still need to stay focused on, you know, things in our realm. So it, you know, we can't take on, you know, emergency shelters and, you know, pet shelters and transportation options and power transmission. You know, we're really focused on those natural resource and water resource related items. So those are the areas we built out for our plan, grouped in groundwater, natural resources, and infrastructure. And again, as we go through this list, you'll start to see that these lists of items that came from this climate planning effort are things that are already in watershed district management plans and have been for a long time. So we'll start to see a lot of overlap, and we'll come back to that. So groundwater quantity and quality. So kind of back to conservation and pollution prevention. Protect our aquifers and make sure they're around for a long time. All of Southern Washington County gets all of their drinking water from the aquifers. So it's a very important issue on people's minds. Natural resources, invasive species, corridor enhancement. So we've got a number of greenway corridors, trail corridors, former stream corridors that are all still more or less natural. We want to keep them that way, improve them, connect more of them together to get a bigger network. Reduce lawn, control ravines, address a lot of our impaired waters, protect our non-impaired waters, build that urban forest canopy, address soil health. And then stormwater or storm sewer infrastructure, I'm sure some of you have seen this exercise. We looked at trying to calculate a combined failure risk. So it's the idea of looking at all of the pipes within our district from a number of factors. So one, you know, what is the likelihood of those pipes failing? So it's, you know, pipe material, age, kinds of soils those pipes are bedded on, the slope adjacent to those pipes. And then looking at consequences of failure. So things like, do those pipes go under large roadways or rail corridors? Are they trunk facilities? Do they serve large communities? How many structures would be impacted if a pipe or a structure failed? Or would failure lead to large ravine erosion? And combining those two different factors, we come up with a combined risk. So you see it in our communities, we have, you know, a lot of concerning infrastructure. Some of it, you know, right through the central part of our northern watershed is the primary drainage pathway for runoff of the entire city of Woodbury. And then these neighborhoods with a lot of yellows and orange and reds are older river communities with, you know, really, really old, undersized infrastructure, all of which are a concern and have been for some time. So our plan summarized those three areas of concern for South Washington and identified these recommended next steps, all of which are complete or ongoing. Obviously adopting the plan, sharing the information with our stakeholders, collaborating on implementation. So that's, you know, within the plan, there's a number of identified gaps in coordination and emergency response planning. And since then, we're working to fill some of those gaps. So we got a bunch of our communities together on kind of that central drainage pathway where flow crosses jurisdictional boundaries to identify who's responsible for what on event response. And we're moving forward with that to then also optimize operation of that large combined system to make sure that we're not only protecting communities, but also protecting our resources downstream and not sending more water than we need to. We've expanded our incentive programs. So we have a standard cost share program, which is focused on improving water quality of lakes and streams. But we also have a coordinated capital improvement program, which we use to partner with our cities, county, any other government entity with right-of-way, essentially. So if they're undertaking a capital project and have the opportunity to add to their project to increase resilience of infrastructure or resources, we'll help pay for that additional work. And we'll come to examples of work we're covering under that program here in a little bit. And sharing the infrastructure analysis. So that's, we've shared the information. We haven't made much progress on prioritizing and addressing some of those concerning pieces of infrastructure, primarily because the cities have been working to complete their own comp planning efforts, and frankly are still getting caught up on maintenance. We're hitting the maintenance backlog on stormwater infrastructure where it doesn't make sense to a lot of communities to go replace things that haven't failed when there's a lot of other things that need more immediate attention. So we're kind of working through that issue. But I think that for South Washington, the biggest idea to come out of our resilience plan is summed up by this figure that we found from the World Bank. So we're really focused on managing, disaster risk. And it's what our watershed district has always done, and I think most watershed districts have always focused on managing risks. When we were first formed, that risk was flooding and only flooding. Now it's more water quality, more managing a watershed, so more source control. If you think back to those risks that our community partners identified in our workshops, those risks aren't really changing. Because they're not really changing, our specific strategies for addressing the risks don't necessarily need to change either. I think what changes for us are the types of projects that get prioritized, to where, in the past, projects that filter phosphorus out of stormwater would have been the highest priority. Now those projects are sharing that focus with, turf conversion and natural land cover restoration, maintenance of existing stormwater infrastructure, planning efforts, building partnerships, educating our communities, all with the idea that, addressing shortcomings in a lack of maintenance or reducing exposure by building more natural landscapes or addressing existing impairments or existing erosion concerns all build a more resilient community so we can withstand, a growing climate hazard or increased environmental variability generally. So that's the takeaway for us. It's that, we're still using a lot of the same strategies we have used for a long time. Just the priority of the specific projects changes a little bit. So I just want to spend the end of my presentation going over some of the specific projects where we continue to undertake in South Washington County with this idea of managing a risk. Right, so this is specific to groundwater. As mentioned in our resilience plan, both conservation and pollution prevention. So we're working with several of our communities. This one shows, irrigation controller program in the city of Woodbury. We're working with Cottage Grove as well to help them fund equipment to help landowners convert their existing irrigation systems to smart systems to use less water and conserve aquifers. Likewise, we're working with those communities to retrofit their de-icing trucks with better spreading equipment, better tracking equipment, so they use less salt overall, use it more effectively, but put down less overall so that we protect our groundwater and surface water from chloride runoff. So not something explicitly tied to climate change, but something that builds a more resilient community by addressing some other areas, and will hopefully protect us into the future as we do see more impact from climate change. So this is a good example of something that was in play long before we ever started talking about climate change and resilience and adaptation. Just kind of orient you a little bit. This line right here is more or less the boundary between the developed part of Woodbury and the undeveloped part of Woodbury and Cottage Grove. So approximately 80% of the city of Woodbury drains to Bailey Lake right here, which then comes down to a lift station, gets pumped over the hill, and drains to this series of regional infiltration basins that the South Washington Watershed District has worked to develop over about the last 30 years, actually, to provide flood control, but also prevent that water from just going downstream into the Mississippi River. And the system has to date has never discharged anything. But that system that was built for flood control in the past is being restored to all native prairie to get more infiltration capacity out of the system in the future when we'll need it. And we're also being much more protective of the system. So and obviously there'd be pressures to let adjacent developments discharge more water to these regional infiltration basins. We're holding the line to make sure that the infiltration capacity of this large system will last as long as possible into the future when it'll be needed more. On the natural resources side of things, so this will be a good example of work we've always done, but work that took on a higher priority after our adaptation and resilience planning. So this was a pilot project with South Washington County Schools, where we worked with them to convert 15 acres of turf to prairie, and then planted 200 trees as well on this campus site. So this is actually an elementary school and middle school campus combined. So we converted 15 acres to natural land cover. We put in 2 outdoor classrooms, and also brought in some of our community partners from various nature centers and the Washington Conservation District to deliver an in-class 6-week-long education program to teach the 5th graders about watersheds and water quality and how their actions impact water resources in the district. This is something that in a decade ago we would have put funds toward a project like this if the district wanted to undertake it. We never would have led a project like this. But with the idea of building a more resilient landscape and educating students, it takes on a higher priority for us. And this pilot program is now expanded. We're actually working on 7 different school campuses in our district right now. Addressing existing impairments. So this is some traditional work that watershed districts have always done, putting in stormwater BMPs to treat runoff going to district lakes. but we're focusing on larger opportunities. So these, knowing that we're seeing more rain, getting more runoff, that runoff's carrying more pollutants into the lakes. We're looking for larger opportunities and sizing those BMPs to treat larger events. So hopefully we can not only address some of that existing impairment, but also prepare for ongoing increases in runoff and maintain the improvements that we do get. Ravines are a big problem for us, even under existing conditions. So, we have those two rivers on our borders. Both of them have pretty sizable bluffs that have very sandy, loose soils. So we get a large rain event and these large ravines open up. And once they get opened up, they just continue to get worse and worse. So we actually are spending more and more of our time identifying and addressing some of these concerning ravines. They don't all need to be stabilized. A lot of them will heal over on their own, but when we find a ravine like this, we end up having to do quite a bit of rate control on the top and then stabilizing throughout the corridor and kind of reestablishing some stable slopes. So that as we get increased frequency of larger rain events, that they can withstand that and don't continue to get worse and wash sediment into the rivers. Infrastructure. So this is coming back to our regional infiltration basin system. We're trying to operate that without discharging, and we're taking steps to maximize the infiltration capacity we get out of that system for as long as we can into the future. But at some point when the system is fully taxed and fills up, we have an overflow for the system now. So this 72-inch pipe to carry water out of the system down through Cottage Grove to the Mississippi River. But we also have a secondary connection to the City of Cottage Grove system. So out of this large diversion structure at the outlet, it actually has a tie-in to the City of Cottage Grove system as well. We get a little bit of capacity out of the regional system if we were to need it, but it also provides an outlet for the city's system when it's taxed and our regional basins are not full. The city system can actually back up into our system rather than flooding homes downstream in Cottage Grove. So again, that idea of addressing existing concerns over flooding and system capacity, but also looking forward to the future when potentially additional capacity is needed for a larger regional event. Along those same lines, this is a roadway, a park road within Ravine Regional Park in Cottage Grove. The old culvert was undersized and failed out of the park road. So we worked with Washington County Parks and the City of Cottage Grove to relocate the entire road away from the edge of the lake and replace it with an outlet that will not only maintain today's lake elevation, but maintain it into the future while passing larger rain events, along with overflow from that regional system upstream. So it's, going forward, it's much of the same. This idea for us of managing risk by addressing all of our shortcomings, whether it's poor planning or lack of maintenance, with the idea that by doing so, we'll build a more resilient community, more resilient systems, and resilient resources so that we can better withstand and prepare for those climate changes, which are coming, but not totally well defined yet. So we're doing the best we can to prepare for it using our existing programs and existing implementation structures. That's it for me.
Great, John. Thank you very much. So now we can open up things for the Q&A. You have questions, go ahead and ask them, and button in the box down at the bottom of your screen. We do have one in there now, and I have a couple as well that I'm curious about, but one from Laura Milberg. When you increase the size of BMPs to accommodate larger, more intense rainfall events, what design standards do the districts use?
So that's a question we're trying to answer ourselves, mostly for the regulatory side of things, and just future planning on operation and maintenance of combined systems. But with regard to sizing our regional BMPs, where it really affects us is we have a community full of ponds and wetlands. When we get more ongoing high rainfall, wet periods, those just sit fuller. So we actually end up with, not necessarily larger runoff events hitting our BMPs, but more sustained base flow coming out of those full ponds and wetlands. So a lot of these regional BMPs we're now designing are actually sized to treat a larger, more consistent flow. So I think it's a little different for us on that side of things, but also looking at, for pond sizing, for instance, if we look at the curve on kind of the diminishing point of return for, money spent, we would try to stay on the higher end of that, knowing that, today we might be paying more for what we get out of the BMP. In the future, that might not be the case anymore. It might be more in that optimal range.
Okay, thank you. So another question from Christine. Could you talk more about the salting equipment and smart water systems? Where can SWCDs look to find information on the technology?
Not a lot. Again, that's work led by our communities. But if you reach out to the City of Woodbridge specifically, they have some great resources on, especially the smart irrigation systems that tie into not only soil moisture, but also predicted rainfall coming. So it won't water if there's rain expected in the next 24 hours. But I think their program, it's actually a very generous program. I think the upgrade to the systems, the controller is, $200 to $300. I think the residents pay, $20 or $30 to get that equipment. And then on the de-icing side of things, a lot of the work that our communities do are really focused on just optimizing use of chemical. So if it's too cold, it doesn't pay to put down more. They do various things with brines and pre-wetting to make sure that the material they do put down sticks to the road. Try not to overlap. So they've actually got some GPS positioning stuff so that they can track where people go and aren't sending people over the same routes when they don't need to. But again, it's for de-icing, I definitely reach out to public works departments that are working on it. They're going to be able to give you much more specifics on the kinds of equipment and where to get it.
Thanks. So thinking through other areas or organizations that are looking to do a plan similar to what you all ended up doing, what advice would you give? What challenges did you see that you would want them to be aware of? What would you share with them from your experience?
Frankly, I was surprised at how well it went for us, and I'd encourage any other community to do it. It's something I think we were hesitant somewhat going into it, being concerned about what kind of pushback might we get, climate deniers and people that didn't want to act on it, but really got none of that. And that's from a community where, up until we started this planning effort, there was very little discussion at all on climate change or how it impacted our communities. One of our former board members, I think, would have been classified himself as a climate denier and not wanting to discuss it. But but again, approaching it as we did from this risk management standpoint, which is something we've always worked on and something we all see higher rainfall events coming. So whether you think it's climate change caused by humans or something else, it's still something that needs to be addressed. So I think from that standpoint, it's a lower hurdle to get over. But that being said, again, I was surprised at how well it went and how much interest we got and how much people cared and were appreciative of the chance to discuss their concerns and shape strategies going forward.
Yeah, a question from Beth that's kind of similar. Could you share information on the planning exercises you did in the 2017 workshops, and trying to figure out how to take the concept of resiliency and operationalize it?
Yeah, so that was actually, it was largely shaped by Freshwater Society. So Freshwater Society staff and bar engineering staff really helped facilitate those workshops, and the table exercises themselves is pretty, again, wide open, where we had a large map of the community on the table. It really just gave the folks a chance to start pointing out areas they were concerned about. So areas where they had already seen flash flooding, for instance, for intersections that had water backing up, or areas where they knew invasive vegetation was growing, where erosion was happening, or communities that were cut off from the larger community from highways or railroads. It just gave them a chance to start pointing out all the areas they were concerned about. Having just heard from agency folks on how they were seeing impacts of climate change play out. And then, so the second day we came back with, here's the list of everything you identified, everything you're concerned about. What are your ideas to start addressing some of those concerns and those risks? It was really, it put the ball in their hands and they ran with it.
Yeah, I was going to ask also about if you encountered any people who were skeptical of the science of climate change, but you already answered that already.
Pleasantly surprised. I mean, we it was a number of people participating, and we didn't, go out of our way to limit anybody we were concerned about. But if they were in the room, they didn't speak up, so it went really well.
So, kind of having gone through this, and both from the planning and now into the implementation of it, can you talk a little bit about the needs or the challenges that you're seeing for building resiliency in communities and organizations like South Washington?
Well, the big one that already came up in the Q&A was, a design event, so something to target going into the future. And we continue to work with our communities on kind of that combined regional system where water comes out of Woodbury and our system overflows through Cottage Grove. So we have two community systems overlapping along with our regional system, and there's obviously county roads bordering that on all sides. That system, it's designed very robustly, and we have all the confidence in the world that it could withstand even back-to-back, Atlas 1400-year events. We're at the point where we want to look forward, can this withstand what would be the design event in 50 years or 100 years? But we're trying to figure out what exactly that event is, even what kind of magnitude are we looking at? Just knowing that if we need to start coming back and revisiting this regional system, it's going to take a long time to make changes to it. So I think, looking for some of that planning guidance is still a concern for us. One that hopefully will be filled somewhat soon. I know the university is looking on putting together some summary information from downscaled modeling, but hopefully we'll have it soon.
Yep, that's a good plug for that work and some of what the folks here at the university have been doing. So you talked about this a little bit, but for the things that were raised in the planning process that were outside of the watershed district's purview, can you talk a little bit about what you did with that information, how you worked with the community, other community partners, other communities?
We really just passed it on. So again, we invited this whole group of people, invited the other communities to participate because we wanted that, that full planning process, since this hadn't been done yet in Washington County generally. So we wanted this to not only inform what the watershed district was doing, but also the communities. So we left it wide open, and those really societal impacts that came up that people were concerned about, we passed on to the cities to continue their planning efforts. And I believe some of that has showed up in their comp plan. So this was, again, 2017, we had the workshops. They were working on their comp plan updates in 2018, 2019. So all this information was available to them in their planning.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we're kind of at the end of our questions. Was there, kind of based on that, anything else that you wanted to share with the audience here?
No.
Okay, good. Oh wait, one more that popped up. Can you share the process for infrastructure analysis, software approach?
It's largely a desktop GIS exercise. So collecting soil data, pipe data information, watershed sizing information, contributing to a specific section of pipe, and then combining that with some folks' concerns. Again, that desktop map exercise where they identified, this neighborhood potentially floods, but it's a small neighborhood. There's no trunk highways nearby, no infrastructure. But if this neighborhood over here floods, it's got a hospital, and it's got the only connection for the neighborhood to the freeway. So it's a lot of stuff like that. So it's trying to make things as objective as possible coming out of a workshop, and it worked pretty well.
Great. Right, well, John, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing a little bit of yours and the South Washington Watershed District experience. Really appreciate you being here. For others, if you're the audience here, our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, June 15th, also from 12 to 1. And I will make a little quick plug again for the evaluation. If you have a minute to fill that out, about 5 minutes, shouldn't be more than that. And then also, if you want to subscribe to our our MCAP email list, I will put that in the chat as well. And so we will hopefully see many of you next month. And John, thank you again for joining us today.